Hi everyone, Allison from Meadow Quilting. It's January and I am about to make the Wedge Star block from Studio 180 Design. I'm working on the calendar project that I've chosen for myself for this year. Each month I'm going to make some blocks from each of the different quilts featured in the calendar. And I'm going to be making a little quilt or a quilt where I'm just going to keep adding borders. Every month will be a border add around. I have some fabric here that is my whole tub full of fabric to choose from. The cut crystal pattern uses the Wedge Star and the Tucker Trimmer 3 to make 12-inch blocks. For the center of my quilt, I'm going to be making a smaller block. I'm going to be making a 6-inch block. I want to see what my measurements should be for a 6-inch block. For a 6-inch block, I'm going to be cutting 1 3/4 inches for my diamond strips, 2 3/4 inches for my small wedge strips, and 3 inches for my corner squares. I need to cut my diamond units from my diamond strip. I need to get a 45-degree angle, and the easiest way to do it is to line the solid line of my Wedge Star tool against the top edge of my fabric strip. I'm going to bring a regular ruler right beside, I've got a straight edge, hold it down, slide my Wedge Star tool away, and cut. Now I'm going to use the same measurement as my strip, 1 3/4, and I'm going to cut 1 3/4 wedges. To cut left-handed, I'm going to have the start of my strip over on the right-hand side. I'm going to line my Wedge Star tool up against the top edge of my strip, slide my second ruler in, pull away my Wedge Star, and cut. Then all I need to do is slide that measuring ruler over, measure my 1 3/4 inches, and cut my strips. I need a total of 8 diamonds. I'm going to cut the small wedge units from my 2 3/4 inch wide strip. I'm going to use the very tip mark. There's a line there at the very tip, and I'm going to line that up on the right hand or on the top edge of my strip. I'm going to use any of the available horizontal lines to line up at the bottom, and I'm going to trim off this edge. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip my strip over, line everything up, and trim the right edge. I'm going to rotate my tool, line the edge of my tool against the front edge of my strip, and cut. Rotate my tool and trim. And rotate my tool and trim. I have 4 pairs of small wedge units. I'm going to cut my second color of small wedge units, and I'm going to demonstrate left-handed cutting. I line up my little horizontal line at the top, one of my horizontal lines at the bottom, and cut. Then I'm going to flip my strip over and trim. Line everything up at the top, horizontal at the bottom, and trim. I'm going to rotate my mat, my tool, line up my tip, a horizontal line, and my cut edge, and trim. And I'm going to cut another one by rotating the mat, the ruler. I cannot get another strip out of there, unit. I would need to cut more strips, which I've already cut. The instructions tell me to lay out my 3 units with the flat edge across the top. I prefer to arrange and lay out my flat edges at the bottom so that I can do things logically. I'm going to take the diamond, I'm going to move it over on top of the left hand wedge triangle, and I'm going to sew. I'm going to press towards the diamond and then place the second small wedge on top and stitch. I want to have a little bit of overhang that kind of mimics the same amount of hanging off the tip here, but I want most of my fabric at the top. My units have been sewn. My seam allowances go to the diamond and then go to the right hand wedge triangle. When I look over, those seam allowances are going the same direction. It's important for the next step. To trim my diamond points, I'm going to be using these seam lines as a guide, and I'm going to be using the 6 guideline for my 6-inch block. There are 2 diagonal lines, and I'm going to line those up on the seams as best I can, and I'm going to trim. Now, I'm going to trim right-handed, so I'm going to angle this just a little bit more, line it up, and trim. Up one side and down the other side. There we go. Let's try left hand trimming. I'm going to turn it, angle it off towards the left. I'm going to find that 6 mark, line up my seam lines, and trim. I'm not going to trim this back end yet. I will do that later. My units are all trimmed, and now I'm going to sew pairs together. And because my seams are pressing in the same direction, when I go to pin these 2 units together, my seams are going to be nesting at that little seam intersection. I'm going to take a pin and put it in to hold it, and I'm going to match up the tip and put a pin in there to hold that tip together. I haven't trimmed this back end, so I'm not expecting them to match, but I will make sure that my seam line does match. I'm going, I'm going to sew my quarters. My diamond wedge points are sewn into quarters. Now I'm going to match 2/4 to make a half. And what we're going to do, again, we're going to match those seam intersections, but we're also going to match up the tips. I'm going to pin where that seam intersection is, and I am going to pin to keep that seam line matched up perfectly. I'm going to sew both my pairs or both sets of quarters into pairs. My pairs are sewn, and now I have to match up the centers. I have to match up these seam allowances and these seam allowances. So the first thing I'm going to do is match up my center points. I am going to be looking for where those seam intersections are, and I'm going to put a pin in. If my pin slides in easily, it means that I've gone between the threads on my seam. That's one of the reasons I press the seam allowance open. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the same spot on the other side and push through. So right now, both of my seam intersections are matched up perfectly. I'm going to keep that pin perpendicular and slide in 2 pins beside at an angle. Now, if I was to tip this pin and sew, it would push this lower layer of fabric down, and I would lose that seam intersection. So I'm going to keep my pin nice and straight. I'm going to slide in and stab through, and I'm going to slide to the other side and stab in and slide through. Okay, so now I can remove this pin. I'm going to match up my seam intersections on those wedges, nesting those seam allowances. And I'm going to sew. If I've done it well, I have a perfect match in the center. Our next step is to take our corner squares and cut them in half diagonally. I have 2 layers of fabric, so I have 4 triangles. I'm going to be adding those triangles to this purple side. What I want to do, so each of these purple corners, so what I want to do is I want to trim this off the flat edge. So I need my Wedge Star tool. And what I'm going to do is line up the back end line, the very top line on my flat end, and I have some diagonal lines from the corner there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up those outside edge trim lines. And theoretically, they should all come all the way down to here. And I'm going to cut. One more time, right-handed, line up the very, very tip line, the dotted line, match it all up, and trim. Lefties, we're going to turn our ruler, and this is the edge we're going to use. So we need to have that fabric piece and that back edge of our ruler matching. And one more. Rotate and trim. I'm going to add my corner squares onto here. We have just precision trimmed this edge. So when we sew our corner triangles on, we're going to put them on so that we have a little tail hanging off either end. But we are going to sew this side up, our block side up. We have a seam intersection here, and we want that stitching line to go right at that seam intersection. Because I sewed with my triangle, corner triangle on the underside, as I was stitching, I could see that I stitched right at the intersection of that seam. And when I fold back to press, I'll have a beautiful tip. The cut crystal pattern calls for the Wedge Star tool and the Tucker Trimmer 3 tool. The pattern makes 12-inch blocks. I'm only making a 6-inch block, so what I can do is I can use my Tucker Trimmer rather than my big Tucker Trimmer 3. When I am going to trim with my Tucker Trimmer, there are a couple of lines that I need to pay attention to. I have the center diagonal line, I have a big circle, and I have a half circle. Depending on how I'm going to trim these units will determine which end I am going to be measuring from. If I was going to trim the cut measurement to a whole number, I would be using my full circle. But because I'm going to be trimming my cut measurement to half, 6.5 inches, I'm going to be using my half circle measurement, and I line up the tip of the diamond with that diagonal line, that center diagonal line, and the center diagonal line here. And then my 6.5-inch line, I'm going to move so that it's lined up on this point, this point, this point, and this point. We're a little too big over there. Now I'm going to trim. There we go. I've done this side, measuring for 6.5. I'm going to lift up my tool. I'm going to rotate my block 180 degrees, lay down my tool, and now I have an extra set of dotted lines. I have a dotted line along here for 6.5 and a dotted line up here. I'm going to line up those dotted lines for 6.5 inches. My center line should still match up, and I'm going to cut. If I was going to be doing this left-handed, my half circle would be over on this side. I finished my block. I've added a 1-inch finished zinger in the background fabric. So I've cut my strips 1.5 inches and just framed it. Then next I'm going to be adding 2 sides of a border for February. And it is the Snowdrops pattern. And we have the option of corner beam, corner pop, rapid fire Lemoyne star, and V block. Not sure which ones I'll use yet, but you can join me for February. Happy quilting.